my answer to what is Hamartia, that it is really an abnormally formed amygdala peculiar to human beings, raised several more questions. I began to see it as a disorder, similar to the developmental disorders of the students I used to work with every day. Their brains hadn't developed normally, and their behaviors reflected that. Of course, they still had choices they could make, but those choices would be heavily influenced by their abnormal neurological development. We had to gently correct harmful behaviors, but what we were really taking note of and keeping track of was whatever progress they were making, no matter how small. We expected the aberrant behaviors because of the disorders, but what we kept track of and celebrated were the behaviors which average human beings would just consider normal and appropriate. The same is true of any good parent with a child with a developmental or psychological disorder. You don't keep track of the wrong behavior. You expect that and correct it when it's happening. But you forget all about it when they do something normal and appropriate. You flat out celebrate that, encourage that, nearly dance for joy over that. Similar to Jesus' question, I had to ask, if we as human beings, being as twisted as we can be sometimes, know to do this with our own children, why wouldn't God do so as well with us? Why would He demand repayment for each and every one of our disorder-influenced harmful behaviors, much less a blood sacrifice? Why would His focus be on what we do wrong instead of what we do right? While this question may have been subversively beginning to form in my subconscious, it was a series of different podcasts by different people who had deconstructed that really brought it into focus when they asked, what kind of a God who is love or Father would demand the murder of His own Son in order to forgive people? Well, I had heard the criticism before, of course, and brushed it off. Now it hit me squarely between the eyes. It was the kind of thing one of the pagan tribal gods from mythology might demand, but not the God which is described in the pages of the New Testament, or even, for that matter, the God who is described in the prophets of the Old Testament. This was never really the intention of any of the authors of the New Testament, much less the Old. But then this leads to the question, what does it then mean that Christ died for our sins, as the Scriptures teach? The practice of animal sacrifice is an ancient one. From what I've been able to read on the subject, there have been animal sacrifices from the very beginnings of human civilization, and from even before this. When the first explicit animal sacrifices are mentioned in the book of Genesis in the Scriptures, the practice was already well established. What's important to note here is that prior to the book of Exodus, God never asks for or requires a sacrificial offering. With this in mind, the first actual mentions of animal sacrifice in the Scriptures assume it as an established practice with meaning, and one which God did not explicitly ask for. In every instance, the initiative is taken by human beings to build an altar and offer a sacrifice in order to honor Him in some way. The one exception here is actually Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, a human sacrifice no less, also practiced from extremely ancient times, which the text makes clear that God had no intentions of Abraham going through with it. This understanding of blood sacrifice as an established practice continues into the Mosaic Law. If you notice in the text of the law, in a similar way that it treats things like slavery and polygamy, the Mosaic Law doesn't actually establish the practice of sacrifice in order to forgive sins, but it regulates it, establishing rules, rituals, and specific ways it had to be done, from the building of an altar out in the bush to what the official place of sacrifice was to look like to the priesthood in charge of that sacrifice. So what am I driving at here? That animal sacrifice, much less human sacrifice, in order to forgive sins, wasn't God's idea in the first place. It was an idea born out of the dysfunctional human mind, that we could somehow transfer our guilt onto an innocent animal or person and then destroy it by destroying that creature, and had become integrated very early in human culture and society. So what does God have to say about sacrifices? Jesus quotes Hosea 6:6, which says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and a knowledge of God more than whole burnt offerings. In Psalms 40, 6 through 8, the psalmist writes, Sacrifice and offering you didn't desire, the ears you prepared for me. You didn't require whole burnt offering and sin offering. Then I said, Look, I am here. It is written about me in the head of the book. I delight to do your will, my God. Your law is within my heart. In Psalm 50, 7 through 23, God is explicit that sacrifices of animals don't impress him, and that he could do without them. Instead, the worship he wants is gratitude, and people doing what they promised. He really takes issue with folks quoting his laws and covenant, and then hurting and harming others. In Psalm 51, 14 through 17, David writes, in his great penitential psalm, addressing God, and says that, You don't delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give one. Burnt offerings don't please you. He continues by saying, The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. This last part is significant because God very clearly talks about despising the animal sacrifices brought to him by the people of Judah in Isaiah 1, 11 through 20. Animal sacrifices and rituals regulated by the very same Mosaic law which he instructed Moses to write. God tells him to stop bringing them all together because he's sick of them. He then tells them what he wants instead. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from my sight. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, reprove the ruthless, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Notice he says to stop bringing the sacrifices, but then says, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. How were they supposed to do that without animal sacrifices if animal sacrifices were absolutely necessary for forgiveness and absolution? In Jeremiah 7, 21 through 26, God tells the people that he didn't even command Israel regarding sacrifices or whole burnt offerings when he brought them out of Egypt. Instead, he commanded them that if they obeyed what he said, then he would be their God, and they would be his people. So there is an implication that even the sacrifices spoken of in the Torah were someone else's idea and not God's. 1 Samuel 15, 22 to 23 also sums up which God prefers when the prophet tells Saul that God prefers people listening to him to offer animal sacrifices. Finally, there is also Ezekiel 18, where the entire point of the chapter is that if someone who has done a life of wrongdoing turns from that wrongdoing to do what is right, God would forgive him and he would live. Nowhere in this chapter are sacrifices mentioned as being necessary for God to forgive that person. The thrust of the New Testament arguments are that animal sacrifices, the blood of bulls and goats and sheep, could do nothing about our inherited error. The best they could do was make us feel less guilty from a psychological perspective, because something had been tangibly done to make up for it. In reality, however, God never needed them to forgive us. He just needed us to realize our screw-ups, turn around, and seek him. If Christ died for our sins, as the scriptures say, then it wasn't in order to forgive them. But if it wasn't in order to forgive them, then what was it for? When we talk about the New Testament, Christian concept of salvation, we're talking about the New Covenant, which was prophesied by Jeremiah. It is called the New Covenant to distinguish it from the covenant or contract God made with Israel through Moses on Mount Sinai. And Jesus himself uses these words when initiating what is called the Lord's Supper, as well as Mass. And he linked it directly with his own body and blood. In the initial prophetic text, the New Covenant was to be made with the house of Israel. But in the New Testament, it was made with the entire world, and is considered to apply to the entire world. The terms of the New Covenant, as recorded in Jeremiah 31, 33 to 34, are these. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it on their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. What I saw this time, after reading it dozens of times and even memorizing this passage, was where God himself actually put the emphasis. Sure, forgiveness was a part of it at the end. But the first thing, the substantial meat of the new covenant, was that he would put his law in their inward parts and write it on their hearts. It is the first part which God also emphasizes in Ezekiel 11:19-20, where he says, "And I will give them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within you, and I will take the stony heart out of their flesh, and I will give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep mine ordinances and do them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God." In other words, the new covenant was that they would do by nature what his law required. And as Rabbi Gamaliel said, as well as Jesus himself, the entire law given by God to Moses, the Torah, can be summed up in this: you will love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your strength, and all of your conscious mind. And you will love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus added to this the prescriptions to love your enemies and to love one another as I have loved you. So what was it that God would put in their inmost parts and write on their hearts? Love. And for all of their behaviors to be produced from this rather than what produces the harmful ones, which I have previously described as an abnormally formed amygdala, which puts the person into a nearly constant survival mode based on threat assessment, which is motivated by fear. Another feature of the new covenant which is frequently overlooked or dismissed is when he says, "And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord." Consider this in the light of 1 John 4:7-8, which reads, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love." Consider also, in reference to the human amygdala driving behavior through fear-based threat assessment, that the apostle also writes in the same chapter in verses 16-18, "And we have known and have trusted the love which the God holds within us." The God is love, and the person making their home in love makes their home in the God, and the God makes his home within that person. By means of this, love has been brought to completion with us, so that we possess a freedom to speak on the day of decision, because just like that one is, we are also within this world. Fear doesn't exist within love, but the love brought to completion tosses fear out, because fear has discipline, yet the one being afraid hasn't been brought to completion with the love. So what is the new covenant then? Is it about forgiveness and deliverance from a hellish afterlife? No. It is nothing short of God himself becoming the source of the person's behaviors. It is nothing short of bypassing or disengaging from the human amygdala, rendering it inert or on constant standby, while God himself, who is love, takes over and suppresses or disengages that survival response. If it is God himself who is the source of behavior, is he going to murder, lie, cheat, steal, cause schisms, do drugs, commit adultery through you? No, of course not. In the new covenant, rather than being concerned with finding a way to forgive us, we see God working to treat our neurological problem directly. The forgiveness we find in the new covenant comes from agreeing with him about our problem and seeking to do what he wants, just as he said in Ezekiel 18, and not from a blood sacrifice as such. But then the question must be asked, if his death and resurrection wasn't about payment or retribution for our crimes and wrongdoing, how could his death and resurrection make us right from an abnormal or malfunctioning amygdala? You know, the truth is, I asked this question for years. You know, I just accepted what I was taught, but I asked this question for years. Now, here I'm going to need to talk about the after effects of near-death experiences. And these are experiences that people have had when they have literally died on an operating table from a heart attack, something wrong with the brain. These are the after effects of the experiences that people have when they have experienced brain death, their heart stopping for a certain period of time, sometimes up to 45 minutes. In one case, a gentleman basically had no cerebral cortex for a week. So first, I'm going to quote Dr. Bruce Grayson, MD, a psychiatrist who has studied the phenomenon for almost 5 decades. Regardless of their cause, NDEs can permanently and dramatically alter the individual experiencer's attitudes, beliefs, and values. The literature on the after effects of NDEs has focused on the beneficial personal transformations that often follow. A recent review of research into the characteristic changes following NDEs found the most commonly reported to be loss of fear of death, strengthened belief in life after death, feeling specially favored by God, a new sense of purpose or mission, heightened self-esteem, increased compassion and love for others, lessened concern for material gain, recognition, or status, greater desire to serve others, increased ability to express feelings, greater appreciation of and zest for life, increased focus on the present, deeper religious faith or heightened spirituality, search for knowledge, and greater appreciation for nature. These after effects have been corroborated by interviews with near-death experiencers, significant others, and by long-term longitudinal studies. Atheists become pastors. Selfish people become selfless. Ordinary people develop paranormal abilities, and that is documented. And as a person exceptionally familiar with the New Testament narratives and letters, I cannot help but see the parallels with the experiences of the early Christians, who are written about therein. I also cannot help but recognize the emphasis placed on dying to self, dying with Christ, and as Paul wrote point blank in his letter to the Colossians as to why they were to be mindful of the things within the heavenly realms instead of minding the things on earth. Because you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Jesus taught that his followers needed to die to themselves, and the embrace of this death is the underpinning of all Christian practice. As Paul also wrote in his letter to the Romans, "Don't you know that as many as were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? We were then buried together with him through this baptism into his death, so that just like Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so also we should also walk in a freshness of life." I read the list of after effects of an NDE, and it seems like that is exactly what these folks are experiencing after literally returning from being clinically dead, sometimes for relatively long stretches of time, like I said. Thinking again about where it says in Romans 6, the person who died has been made right from Hamartia, and that's literally what it says in the Greek, as it relates to the after effects experienced by people who have had near-death experiences or literal death experiences and have returned to life. That is, people who have literally died for a period of time, sometimes quite extended, with either brain death, the stopping of the heart, or both, and resuscitated or resurrected. Let's be honest here. The thought which occurred to me is that this is literally a mechanic of death and resurrection, regardless of how it happens. That is, a disengagement from one's malfunctioning responses and engagement with the Logos of God. That immaterial part of oneself suppressed by the malfunctioning amygdala is a natural and normal result of death and resurrection, as is evidenced by people who have had NDEs and consistently display a greater love, joy, peace, compassion, loss of a fear of death, a greater interest in spiritual things, a greater sense of connection with God, and even paranormal or supernormal abilities, regardless of the belief system that they started with. I mean, consider the charismata, or the spiritual gifts that Paul talks about. So why did Jesus die? Why did he voluntarily sacrifice himself in the place of every human being? And that is what the New Testament teaches. Why did he do it? So that every human being would be able to be free from the domination of their abnormally functioning amygdala by experiencing death and resurrection without actually having to physically go through it. So that they would be free to choose God himself as their source of behavior rather than this bit of malfunctioning flesh. And this is the assumption which Paul makes throughout his letters, urging those to whom he is writing to choose to operate within the Spirit rather than with the flesh, to remain connected with the head of the body, the Logos, who is Jesus Christ, of whom we are all members, pieces and fractals, and who is identified with the God himself. and he is clear about one's options in this matter. One is either enslaved to one's abnormal amygdala, one's flesh, or one willingly enslaves themselves to the God of whom they are a part, the Spirit. There are no other options. The salvation which is taught in the New Testament has to do with being freed from the harmful behaviors caused by our constant, fear-based survival responses, and being free to communicate once more with that part of ourselves which is one with God Himself. It is about the realization of the new covenant and having the heart and will of God activated and written within each one of us, so that we do not cause harm to one another, and so that we love as He loves, because He is the one loving through us.